Whether you're looking to learn how to play MANNADIUM or learn how to beat it, you've come to the right place. What's up guys, this is tcgsam here, and in today's video, I'm coming at you guys with a guide on everything you need to know about how to master MANNADIUM. Now this video assumes that you know what the core cards of the deck do, so I won't be going over each of their individual effects, but rather I'm going to talk about things that you wouldn't see in like regular videos, talking about like specific card interactions and things to remember when playing each card, which is good for when you get disrupted while playing the deck or when you just need to adapt on the fly. There are plenty of videos out there with the combos on how to end on certain boards with certain starting hands, but this video should be more focused on what you don't learn in those other videos. So with all that being said, let's just hop straight into it. So starting off with the general playstyle of the deck. So very first, right off the bat, you're going to notice that a lot of their cards destroy their own tuners in order to gain advantage. So cards like REICHHEART, STARFROST, ABSCISSION, they all destroy the MANNADIUM tuners, which get effects when they're destroyed in order to build more advantage and build monsters on the board to perform their synchro plays with. At the end of the day, it is a synchro toolbox centering around STARFROST. You want to always get STARFROST into rotation for your synchro plays, for your SCARECLAW REICHHEART, and for Vicious ASTRALOUD. Now, the ideal first turn structure you're going to notice most of the time is to start by getting Visas into rotation, summoning it out, and then synchroing it off for a card like Burrow in the Floor to protect yourself from other hand traps, bringing it back with Arrival or Dispatter, and then linking it away for SCARECLAW REICHHEART in order to get to your SCARECLAW side of the deck, and then finally banishing it from your graveyard to make Vicious ASTRALOUD under a cross sheep in order to make like more link materials, or go for a synchro 10 from there. So since STARFROST is so important to the deck, I decided there were a few things I wanted to mention about STARFROST in this deck. So first off, there are only certain monsters you can actually target in the deck to actually summon STARFROST from his hand. So it's very important to remember that when you're trying to play against the deck, just remember that STARFROST can only destroy stuff that has a different type and attribute, which means the heart monsters like REICHHEART and REICHHEART don't work. The only cards you can really destroy are the MANNADIUM tuners and the SCARECLAW REICHHEART in terms of its own engine. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to play the deck and disrupt the deck. Just remember that those monsters are key to have on the board in order to actually destroy them with STARFROST. I'll say it again, it's the most important card to get into rotation because it's a tuner, it's fodder for ASTRALOUD and REICHHEART. So if you can cut your opponent off from getting access to STARFROST, then they're going to struggle to actually put up much of a board other than maybe like one synchro monster, because without getting to STARFROST, you lose out on so many different bodies that you get from the SCARECLAW plays and Vicious ASTRALOUD. The next best monster in the deck is MANNADIUM REICHHEART. So REICHHEART, the only thing I really want to talk about is its in-hand effect as a quick effect to destroy a MANNADIUM monster or a monster with 1521. It's very important to actually dodge targeting effects or removal effects. So for example, if you summon a MANNADIUM tuner, you activate STARFROST in hand next. Let's say your opponent chain something, try to remove the tuner so that you can't bring the Visas out and you've already burned your normal summon. So most opponents will try to disrupt you in some way there. But if you had held the REICHHEART in your hand, then you can actually use REICHHEART to target that tuner instead, to summon it out, destroy it, and then still get a few bodies out from there. You can also use REICHHEART to manipulate the level of Meeks very specifically, or trigger CALARIUM on request, but just be careful of how many Meeks you actually go through if you destroy it with REICHHEART. You want to make sure you still have at least one in your deck. For example, if you do need to bring out a level 4 later on in your combo. Also, just another small thing, you can pop your SCARECLAW REICHHEART with it if you start with it and your opponent tries to like infinite impermanence it for some reason. There's that option as well. Or if you start with REICHHEART and REICHHEART, you can always get REICHHEART out onto the board later. So what you can do is start by normal summoning REICHHEART and then going on with your combo from there. And then next up, I'm going to be talking about the tuners, so MANNADIUM Torrid and MANNADIUM Meek. It's important to note that they do trigger if they're banished. So if you destroy them under a card like a REICHHEART or Dimension Shifter, they still get their effects to summon from deck, which is very important. And then Torrid's effects to summon from deck is a hard once per turn, whereas Meek's effect to summon from deck is not hard once per turn. So that makes it so Meek is a lot better of a card, albeit Torrid is still very good because it just acts as extra copies of Meek. And it's important to remember that both are just once per turn to summon from hand, so make sure that you keep in mind how many of these extenders you're going to be able to get onto the board while you're doing your combo. Next up is SCARECLAW REICHHEART. So REICHHEART, it can actually do a simple 1-card Synchro 10 combo on its own, which can force out hand traps or if they don't have any hand traps, it establishes a Barone and a ASTRALOUD access in your graveyard very early on in your combo, having only committed a REICHHEART to it, making it incredibly strong normal summon that your opponent actually kind of has to respect, because if they don't, then you're going to end up with a Barone before you're able to push through with your actual other plays. And like I mentioned, it's best to normal summon first, especially if you have a card like REICHPHOBIA in your hand, meaning REICHHEART's also going to be protected from hand traps at the same time, making it so it's very difficult for your opponent to actually stop you from establishing something on your board at the very least. You also want to keep REICHHEART in the graveyard for Arrival if you're looking to banish Visas, and a 1521 for ASTRALOUD. So most of the time you want to go for banishing REICHHEART, since REICHHEART can't be brought back from the graveyard with like engine cards, whereas REICHHEART can be brought back with a card like Arrival, so that can be very important for that. On the flip side, if you're trying to play against the deck and you see your opponent has like REICHHEART in the graveyard, you could hold something like a DD Crow or a Bestial monster for when they activate their Arrival targeting REICHHEART. You just get a lot of value, because not only do you get rid of their monster from graveyard, you cut them off from an extender. For if it's just ASTRALOUD, you cut them off from an extender body that would have been brought back by SCARECLAW Arrival, and that's just incredibly strong. And then finally, you want to be summoning monsters you control in defense position when you're trying to combo to get its draw effect. So if you're summoning like your MANNADIUM tuners and such, be sure to summon them in defense mode so that you're actually able to get the draw effect during your very first turn, because that's just a bonus effect you shouldn't be missing out on unless your hand isn't very great. So just keep that in mind when you're playing. Even summoning cards like Barone in defense mode can be okay, because most of the time opponents' decks aren't going to be able to get out big monsters to actually swing over the Barone. Next up, we're going to be talking about Peaceful Planet CALARIUM, which is the main field spell of the deck. There's one big thing I want to talk about, is that it has the effect to give light monsters you control 100 attack for every tuner you control and in your graveyard. So that's important to note for a card like REICHHEART, which means if you have a REICHHEART and a CALARIUM on the board and there are tuners on your field or graveyard, then REICHHEART is no longer 1500, 2100 stats, because it now has more attack thanks to Peaceful Planet CALARIUM, and that means you actually can't summon out the MANNADIUM tuners from your hand if you only control REICHHEART, because you no longer control a 1500, 2100 monster, which is pretty annoying honestly if you're trying to play the deck. But just keep in mind that when you're playing the deck, you have to find ways to get those tuners off graveyard if you're trying to summon out the MANNADIUM tuners from hand, and if you're playing against the deck, just make sure your opponent isn't soft cheating you by still summoning out the tuners from hand while they control other tuners. Now, when going second, there's a cool trick that I've picked up when playing the deck, is to actually summon your tuners in attack position and crash into your opponent's attack position monsters to actually trigger both the tuner effect and CALARIUM during the damage step. So why this is important is because, for example, if you have CALARIUM and then a tuner on the board, what you can do is attack with your tuner into your opponent's monster. In the damage step, the tuner and CALARIUM is going to trigger, so what you're going to do is activate the tuner as Chainlink 1 and then CALARIUM as Chainlink 2 to bring it back. That makes it so your opponent actually can't use cards like Ash Blossom and Joy Spring to stop your tuners from summoning themselves out, and through that interaction alone, you get 2 extra bodies on the board, which is very important for synchro plays and or link plays. So just keep that as something in your toolkit when you're playing this deck and going second. Now, finally, what I want to talk about is getting the most out of this card. You want to keep it on the board to try to resolve the bonus effect as much as possible to revive back a tuner. So if you have, for example, the other field spell of the deck being Primitive Planet REICHPHOBIA, what you want to do is try to use the REICHPHOBIA first and then play CALARIUM over it so that you have the best chance to push through disruption, because the extension effect of CALARIUM is incredibly strong at helping you establish a board and play around hand traps, since you can chain block the effects of the tuner monsters to summon from the deck. CALARIUM Reborn also works under Shifter and a REICHHEART just like the tuners, making MANNADIUM able to push through those types of cards just a little bit easier, so that's something to also keep in mind. We're going to be talking about REICHPHOBIA, and REICHPHOBIA, there's not too much to say about it, but just note that it doesn't really do anything on its own. So if you're playing against the deck, your opponent starts with REICHPHOBIA, you probably don't want to Ash it. It doesn't really do anything at all, because if REICHPHOBIA is their only card, then you can't actually do anything in the MANNADIUM deck with just the REICHPHOBIA, whereas something like REICHHEART, on the other hand, can actually do something on its own. It does have a neat effect to go when going second though, so if you're trying to play the Mannadium deck, then even going second, you can summon some of your intermediary monsters that you aren't going to keep on the board in defense mode. So for example, instead of summoning your Baronne in defense, you can just summon, like, let's say your Visas in defense, your REICHHEART in defense, your REICHHEART in defense, and your tuners in defense, just so you get extra value off of REICHPHOBIA to actually destroy a card on the field as a bonus effect. And just keep in mind that also on the flip side, if you're playing against Mannadium, you want to make sure that your monsters aren't in defense position, because otherwise you're opening yourself up to an easier primitive Planet REICHPHOBIA getting value to destroy a card, and REICHHEART being able to get a free draw, since your defense position monsters actually contribute to the REICHPHOBIA total and REICHHEART total. Next up, we're going to be talking about Mannadium Obsidian. So Mannadium Obsidian is a great extender that lets you guarantee a Visas into Lightheart combo unless you start with CALARIUM. So what I mean by that is, like, if let's say you're comboing with some of your other monsters and you get stopped, at any point you can just Obsidian destroy that monster, add CALARIUM, activate CALARIUM, banish Obsidian, summon Visas from hand, link into Lightheart, Lightheart grabs you REICHPHOBIA, then you summon REICHHEART, then you grab out a SCARECLAW rival, and then you have a Synchro 10 from there. So that can be incredibly strong, just as like a safety net, so that even if you get hand trapped, you're still able to end on something and set up Vicious ASTRALOUD in the graveyard at the same time. It's also good to hold if your opening play doesn't specifically involve Obsidian destroying like a tuner, because like I mentioned, it's like that safety net where your opponent's hand trapping you or stopping you in other ways. You want to be able to activate the Obsidian later on and then be able to just go for that Visas combo and still end on something. Now, there is something I want to add. There's like a small caveat to this. If you're going second, I would probably prioritize trying to get Obsidian into the graveyard as soon as possible while you still have monsters on the board, because people who actually know what the deck does will try to remove the bodies off the board. So what I mean is, for example, let's say your opponent normal summons REICHHEART and then REICHHEART grabs them something. If they have a card to actually remove REICHHEART, like, they would consider using something like that right away, so that you can't activate Obsidian, you can't summon your tuners from hand, and that's just very tough for you. So if you have the option to use Obsidian first, then I would definitely try to use Obsidian just to get into the graveyard early, so that you can still extend even if your bodies get removed off the board. Next up, I'm going to talk about Mannadium Reframing. So it helps you play around those cards that would deal with monsters like Lava Golem or Dark Ruler No More. So that's why you want to prioritize getting this card out as disruption, meaning if you are able to, let's say, search this with like REICHHEART instead of, let's say, a extra tuner to summon an extra monster or something like that. But you also want to hold this for as long as possible, since it's the least susceptible to being forced out. If your opponent's not going to be able to really do anything to it unless they have back row removal, it's also just able to hit the most things like out there, such as like Dark Ruler, for example, whereas your monster negates can't. Only destroys the card if you have a Visas or 1521 on your field or graveyard. So there are some cases where you got rid of everything for ASTRALOUD, then Reframing actually won't be able to destroy, and that's something that's could come up, so just be aware of that. And then finally, its last effect, if you've read the card, you know that it can shuffle up to 3 Mannadium monsters in your graveyard, and that really doesn't come up too often, but just keep in mind that you do have access to put back your Meeks and other tuners to be able to start doing your combos again and get a little bit more gas that way if it does come down to that. And then the last main deck key card I would say is Mannadium Imaginings. I think this is optional to play. You don't really have to play this in your Mannadium build. I think it is a little bit win more, because if you already have lots of engine or you have like Reframing, then you can have Amritara search CALARIUM as follow-up, or search SCARECLAW rival as an additional extender. So I think in those cases you don't really need Imaginings either way. Its graveyard effect also doesn't come up enough to where I think it's very strong to actually have it in your deck. So while you can play it as a one of, I don't think you need to play it in your deck. Next up, we're going to be talking about SCARECLAW Lightheart. So Lightheart, there are two ways to really use it. The first one, you start with REICHHEART. You can go into this early to establish a Baronne before doing the rest of your combo, or you can make it late in your combo once you've already started comboing a little bit. Let's say you start with the Mannadium side of the deck, you're able to start with a Baronne, and then from there get access to Visas, summon Visas, make this. And then what this can do then in the later parts of the combo is set up a bunch of bodies on the board for cross sheet plays, whether it's linking or synchroing. It also lets you pivot from the MANNADIUM engine to the SCARECLAW engine, so just keep in mind that if your opponent has access to the MANNADIUM part of their engine, they're going to be able to get access to the SCARECLAW part of their engine because Visa Starfrost is super searchable in the MANNADIUM side of the deck. Finally, just don't forget that this card can bring itself back as an extender if you do control Visa Starfrost or Visa Samratara, since it's treated as Visa Starfrost. This can be important for just Visa Starfrost fodder in hand, or you can use it as link material, so just don't miss out on that effect of this card. Visa Samratara, just a few things I want to talk about is that its synchro capability is actually kind of limited because it's a tuner and it's a level 8, meaning realistically if you're not playing a card like Bishop Balkan, then all you can really make with Visa Samratara in the deck is MANNADIUM Primeheart, which most people don't play, or Crimson Dragon, so just keep that in mind. Amratara is most likely just going to be linked off from the board if you're not playing like the Bishop Balkan FTK version. It's also treated as Visa Starfrost like I mentioned earlier, which means that you can summon your tuners from hand and Lightheart from the graveyard if it's on the board, but also importantly you can turn this into Lightheart. So there are going to be times where you have to start off with Visa Samratara as like a starter, for example to search CALARIUM, and then from there what you can do is just link away the Amratara for Lightheart and then get access to your SCARECLAW engine, and that's incredibly powerful. So just do keep that in mind, that don't be afraid to use Visa Amratara as a combo piece, treat it as Visa Starfrost and use it to summon your SCARECLAW Lightheart. And then finally I want to talk about just a few potential targets that you can add with this. Now everyone knows you can add Reframing and CALARIUM, but a few other cool targets I think that might come up in your gameplay is SCARECLAW Twinsaw, SCARECLAW Arrival for extension if you play multiple, SCARECLAW REICHPHOBIA, which might come up, for example, if somehow you started with Lightheart and then it got negated, or Primeval Planet Perlarino, which all it does is search Visa Starfrost. But if you want a card that searches Visa Starfrost without having to burn through your REICHPHOBIA or your CALARIUM, then that's a potential option as well. Next up, we're going to be talking about Vicious ASTRALOUD. So Vicious ASTRALOUD is probably the scariest card in the extra deck in my opinion, just because of how easy it is to summon. It's not once per turn to summon, it's not once per turn to get its effect either, and it becomes very big once you actually destroy a monster, meaning it just exerts a ton of offensive pressure because you're able to either force something out or destroy opponent's monster that's already been used, let's say a Baronne de Fleur, and then you're going to gain half its attack or defense, and that's just putting up so much damage out onto the board. It's also important to remember that you essentially have a free level 8 body that can be summoned at any time for more synchro or link plays, or to force out disruption and threaten damage. So as long as you're playing and you have access to Visa Starfrost and a 1500, 2100 somewhere in your combo, then you're going to be able to have an ASTRALOUD at the very end of it to either extend further or just push for damage. And then finally, the tip I want to give about this is conserve at least one Vicious ASTRALOUD in the extra deck for follow-up with like a Visas and a 1521 setup in the graveyard already, just as like an insurance policy. Let's say your opponent cracks your board somehow, you're able to bring back Vicious ASTRALOUD, and your opponent just shouldn't be able to deal with that because of how much offense this one card can have on its own. So just keep in mind that you don't necessarily want to be throwing away your Vicious ASTRALOUDs unless you can help it. There are some combos I know where you have to use 2, and most decks only have space for 2, so in those cases I think it's fine. But just keep in mind, if you're playing against this deck, you also want to count how many Vicious ASTRALOUDs your opponent has gone through and whether or not they'll be able to access another one easily, just because of how fast this one card can swing a game in the MANNADIUM player's favor. Next up, we're going to be talking about Cross Sheep, and while this isn't a MANNADIUM card or SCARECLAW card, it actually is a very key part of the combo, so I just want to go over a few points with it. Just remember that the Synchro Attack Boost effect is actually permanent and can come up if you leave Cross Sheep on the board. It does give itself 700 attacks, so it becomes a little bigger at 1400. Just make it survive until the next turn so you can keep getting value off of it. Cross Sheep can also trigger if it points to both a Synchro and a Fusion monster, so if you didn't know, you can have a Synchro monster pointing to Cross Sheep. Let's say you have Cross Sheep on the board, summon a Synchro monster, don't use this effect right then and there, but then if you fusion summon to the other zone, you can get both the effect to gain attack and special summon a level 4 lower monster from your graveyard. So that's just important to remember to summon your Cross Sheep to zones that are pointed as synchros as well, since the 700 attack boost is just free and just makes your monsters a lot harder to out. And then here's like a part I wanted to talk about that isn't necessarily going to be the same across every single deck out there, and that's going to be the extender engine that you play in your deck. So the most common ones are a hero lives with Elemental Hero Prisma, and Kashtira Fenrir with SCARECLAW Kashtira. Both of them essentially help you get into the SCARECLAW part of your deck, Prisma by copying Visa Starfrost's name, and the SCARECLAW Kashtira just by being a SCARECLAW monster. Both of them help you make the link one, and then from there are able to get access to your SCARECLAW side of the deck. Now there are of course pros and cons to both of these engines. A Hero Lives is better at doing things on its own, since it can be a full combo by itself. If the only playable card in your hand is a Hero Lives, you can still end on, at the very least, a Baronne de Fleur and an Appaloosa, which is pretty solid, but it is a lot worse when going second and into a card like Dimension Shifter, since Prisma needs to send for cost. Fenrir is essentially the opposite. It's a lot better at going second and into Shifter, because you're able to force stuff out with the Fenrir, and then you can leave Fenrir on the board as an actual interruption under Shifter, but it actually requires other cards for you to do anything, because for example, if you only have Fenrir and you search SCARECLAW Kashtira, you actually can't do anything with the SCARECLAW Kashtira until Fenrir hits the graveyard. So in that sense, you need other cards for you to actually be able to combo with the Fenrir. So at the end of the day, both are actually pretty viable and can work, but it really depends on how you build the rest of your deck and the format that you're playing in. So let's say you're playing in, let's say, a more Kashtira heavy tournament, for example, then you probably want to go with the Fenrir, whereas on the other hand, you want to go with like Prisma if you want to give your deck just a little bit more consistency and being able to play off of fewer cards. You should be playing at least one of these in my opinion, because if you aren't, then your deck is then fully reliant on its normal summon, and that can be really bad when going second or when you get disrupted. So do keep that in mind. Also, when you're playing against this deck, just know that these are like these sort of extenders that they have access to, meaning if you're able to stop both of their extender pushes and their normal summon push, you're usually able to end the Mannadium player's turn. And then finally, I just want to give a quick shout out to CardTrader Zero and your playmat. Be sure to check them out using the mine links in the description below if you want to get your own custom playmat, custom sleeves. Check out your playmat. You want to get cheap cards shipped to you worldwide without having to pay exorbitant shipping fees, then be sure to check out CardTrader Zero. Both links will provide some benefit to you while also helping to support the channel, so I'd really appreciate that. But with all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Be sure to check out my Mannadium deck profile and combo tutorial if you haven't already, if you want those types of videos. But if you also think I missed anything important, then be sure to let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.